Hey guys! Today we'll be covering a 2020 drama film called I Am Your Woman. The movie opens up in the late 1970s where a beautiful girl, Jean, can be seen sitting in her garden smoking a cigarette. In the background, the narrator narrates that Jean fell in love with Eddie and got married soon after. Despite their marriage, the couple has not been able to have any kids. Every morning, Eddie wakes up and goes to work, leaving Jean alone in the lavish house. One day, Eddie returns home with a kid in his lap, claiming that it's theirs. Jean is surprised to see this and demands an explanation. Eddie, on the other hand, does not say anything and avoids the question. When Jean asks about the child's name, Eddie replies that it's up to her to give him a name. The next day, Jean again tries to ask Eddie about the child, but gets interrupted when a number of people arrive at their house to meet her husband. Eddie closes the door to attend a meeting, and here we can assume that he is involved in some illegal activities. The same night, Jean hears a loud banging at the door, and when she opens it, she finds Eddie's business associate, Jimmy, standing outside. Jimmy hurriedly enters the house and informs Jean that she needs to leave the place as soon as possible. Confused, she asks him what's wrong, but Jimmy just says that something bad has happened. He goes straight to Eddie's closet, packs some stacks of cash, and tells Jean to leave with Cal, a man appointed by Jimmy to keep Jean and her child safe. In the next scene, a worried Jean leaves the house with her child. Cal takes her to a motel to spend the night and also helps her calm the baby down. Jean asks Cal about Eddie's well-being, but the latter mentions that he is only a caretaker and knows nothing else. With Cal continuously addressing her child as a baby, Jean gives him a name, Harry. She then asserts that she would like to call her sister and relatives for help, but Cal stops her from doing so. Rather, he mentions that she needs to remain out of contact and also promises to find a place for her to stay. Jean demands to call her husband and inform him of the situation, but Cal tells her that Eddie is in trouble and that the police are searching for him. Late at night, Jean tries to feed Harry, but he seems to have a fever and keeps on crying continuously. Worried, she wakes up Cal and tells him that they need to take the baby to a hospital. Cal tries to make her understand that going out is dangerous, but she does not listen and leaves. In the next scene, Jean is at the hospital waiting for the doctor to arrive. At the same time, Cal, who is waiting outside, notices a police car approaching the hospital. Scared, he immediately approaches Jean and asks her to walk out of the hospital. Jean cooperates, and the two leave the hospital without being recognized. Sadly, they can't return to the hotel room, and they are compelled to spend the night inside Cal's car in the middle of the road. The next morning, a sheriff wakes them up and asks them to get out of the car. At first, he suspects that Carl is troubling Jean, but when she states that he is her husband, the sheriff believes her and drives away. Later, Cal brings Jean to a new house in a well-settled neighborhood. The house seems to be designed for Jean, as it includes everything she needs. Cal gives her instructions to keep her distance from the neighbors and to remain inside the house. He also provides her with an emergency number to call if any problems should occur. Jean tries to tell Cal that she has never lived alone and asks him to stay with her, but he refuses, saying that he has to go out to work. A few days pass by with Jean living alone in the big house. She faces challenges while making dishes for herself and gets extremely bored. One day, while Jean is ironing her clothes, someone knocks at the door. Startled, she cautiously opens the door and notices an elderly lady named Evelyn standing outside. The old lady introduces herself and mentions that her friend used to live in the house. However, Jean lies and says that she is married. Before leaving, Evelyn hands her new neighbor a bouquet. Next, Jean is in her kitchen trying to make an omelet for herself, but fails miserably. Frustrated, she starts throwing eggs on the wall to release her anger. At the same time, Evelyn arrives outside with a delicious meal for her new neighbor. Since Jean is hungry, she allows the old lady inside, despite Cal warning her to stay away from neighbors. A little while later, when Evelyn asks about the way to the bathroom, Jean becomes suspicious because she had previously mentioned that her friend used to live there. The two chat for a little while longer, and the old lady heads home. Later at night, when Jean walks downstairs, she notices the entrance door open and someone talking inside her house. Terrified, she immediately grabs Harry and hides inside a closet. She tries to call the number Cal gave her, but no one picks up. Desperate, Jean escapes through the window and walks towards Evelyn's house. However, when she enters, she notices Evelyn tied up and choked. Jean is then surrounded by a couple of men who point their guns at her and ask about Eddie. Fortunately, Cal arrives in the nick of time and saves Jean by shooting the two men. He then notices Evelyn on the couch and eliminates her, reasoning that she is a witness and could be a threat to them. Jean is devastated by the incident, but Cal informs her that Evelyn's death was her fault for defying his warnings. In the following scene, Cal relocates Harry and Jean to a rustic cottage that belongs to his family. The cottage has everything that Jean will require, including a secret space where she can hide in case of an emergency. When Jean continuously asks about her husband, Cal finally tells her that Eddie killed his boss Marvin and instigated gang wars to overtake territory previously controlled by Marvin. Furthermore, he mentions that the members of Marvin's gang are looking for Eddie and that Jimmy has already been killed. Jean refuses to believe that Eddie killed his boss, but Cal reveals that he has been killing people for a long time. The next day, Jean notices a vehicle approaching the cottage and immediately goes to the secret cabin to hide, along with Harry. Fortunately, the people arriving there are Cal's family members, including his wife Terry, his father Art, and his son Paul. Paul finds Jean inside the hiding place, and Terry introduces themselves as Cal's family. Together they dine, and Art even helps Jean settle the crying Harry at night. The next day, Art takes Jean to a lonely place inside a forest and teaches her how to use a gun. He hands her an empty gun and asks her to get used to the weight and aim so she can use it properly when required. Scared, Jean goes straight to Terry and asks her why Art is teaching her to use a gun. Terry reveals that she noticed some guys outside her apartment, and for their safety, Cal sent them to the cabin. Furthermore, she tells Jean to be prepared to face whatever situation arises. During their conversation, Jean deduces that Terry was previously married to Eddie, and because of his irresponsible behavior, she left him. After learning about the severity of her situation, Jean eventually decides to learn how to use the gun and goes to the woods alone for practice. A few days pass by, but Cal, who was supposed to return to the cabin, does not arrive, and Terry is worried about him. Jean also has many unanswered questions, so she decides to go find Cal and Eddie. She talks with Terry and asks her to go out and find their husbands together. At first, Terry tries to stop Jean, but when the latter keeps on insisting, she reluctantly agrees. The next morning, the two drive to a town and to a parking lot, from where Terry shows Jean the apartment she formerly called home. Following this, she hands Jean a firearm and tells her to keep it inside her pocket. Later, they leave the place and after changing their clothes, arrive at a club. In order to find Cal, Terry goes to a secret room in the club and meets Mike, Eddie's old friend. Meanwhile, a man at the club tells Jean that Terry stole Eddie's entire life, but still, he went on to build a brand new life and a new family. The man also recommends Jean exercise caution around Terry. While they are talking, Terry returns and tells Jean that they should leave immediately. Right then, Jean questions her about Paul, but Terry does not reply and instead drags her out of the secret room. Suddenly, they hear gunshots from the club and are trapped inside. Terry instructs Jean to remain in the phone booth while she runs out of the club. As the shooter walks past Jean to the secret room, she gets terrified and hides. Somehow, she manages to get out of the club but fails to find Terry. Being lost and alone, Jean walks aimlessly around the city all night. The following morning, when it begins to rain, Jean enters a laundry house in search of shelter and cries. Later, she enters the hotel that Art talked about before and finds Terry. Relieved, Terry mentions that she went back to the club searching for her but couldn't find her. She then starts revealing details of her life. She says that the same year she got married to Eddie, they had Paul. Life was moving on happily, but one day, she learned about Eddie's business and decided to leave. To keep her from going, Eddie made a promise that his next assignment would be his last. But sadly, his last project never finished, and he continued to be involved in illegal activities. She then talks about Cal, who was Eddie's guy, but was terrified by his tactics and was always there for her. They quickly began confiding in one another and eventually fell in love. Hearing this, Jean becomes emotional and says that she never knew her husband's true character. As the two continue talking, Jean discovers that they are actually running away from Eddie. Having no other option, she spends days inside the hotel, waiting for Cal to arrive. One day, Terry receives a call from Cal, warning them to get out of the hotel and meet him at a cafe. Wasting no time, they leave to meet him, but soon discover that there are guys standing outside looking for them. Terry hugs Jean and asks her to keep walking regardless of what she hears. On moving forward, Jean hears gunshots, but she keeps on walking, just as Terry told her. Later, she arrives at the cafe and meets Cal, who informs her that Eddie has recently died. Hearing this, Jean is shocked and decides to leave the town and start a new life with Harry on her own. Moments later, Terry also arrives and Cal becomes happy to see her. He immediately walks up to her and embraces her. Shortly after, they drive away in a car, but Mike's men start following them. While trying to avoid the pursuing car, Terry swerves and drives recklessly. She somehow manages to take a car through a silent road, but unfortunately, she strikes an oncoming car. Cal and Terry are severely injured, but Jean escapes with only mild bruises. Suddenly, Mike approaches the car, drags Jean out, and drives off with her while holding her at gunpoint. Even for a man who kills his own men for asking a lot of questions, he seems very aggressive as he points his gun towards Jean. He asks her about Eddie, to which she replies that he is already dead. As expected, Mike does not believe it, and when he threatens Jean to reveal the truth, she suddenly takes out her gun and shoots him in the head. Jean then drives the car back to Terry and Cal, both of whom are still alive. She pulls the dead bodies out of Mike's car, cleans, and leaves the weapons next to the body in order to make it look to the cops like the thugs had killed each other. After this, an injured Terry helps her drag Cal to the car. At last, Jean reveals to Terry that she killed Mike, and together, they return to the cabin. When they reach the cabin, they see a car and a dead guy lying in the road. Jean accepts Terry's gun and then leaves to look into the matter. Inside, she finds Art lying on the floor, dead along with another man who seems to have been shot by Art. Finally, she finds Paul and Harry inside the hiding compartment beneath the floor. Jean asks Paul to close his eyes to play a game and walks him out of the house, without him noticing the dead bodies inside. After being reunited with their kids, the two families get into their car and leave.